Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Empyrion Galactic Survival episode 121. I'm Enigmaeus and today it's all about the profiles. I promised early in this mini-series that we would be building this ship a little bit differently than we had in the past. Specifically, we would be using layered profiles to define the shape of the hull and do so in a much larger scale than we have in the past. With the first episode, and I think we into the second episode for this build, we spent a lot of time laying out the various different profiles that defined, for example, the rear of the ship. We had the large ellipse, and then we had just a little bit ahead of that a smaller ellipse that defines the central section of the ship, and then we defined the very front of the ship with certain profiles, a vertical and a horizontal profile. And then from there, we just kind of started filling things in and still just using profiles. And then the last episode, I came up with an idea that I was very enthusiastic to try, which didn't involve using profiles, and that was to do the side sections of the ship where the reverse thrusters are located. And now that that's done, I felt it was really important to get back to that plan or promise, depending on how you interpret it, that I had originally made about using the profiles to lay out a really complex hull design, lots of intersecting angles and curves and things that would be kind of difficult to do without a little bit of help, without some sort of guide right there in the game that you can use to kind of get your bearings and keep track very, very easily and very, very visibly of what it is that you're trying to accomplish and how everything is going to fit together. Now, this is one profile that I wanted to change, and I remember I was describing it in the video where I originally made it and said that this is one of those things that could change, and it did, because what I decided is that I wanted it to very, very closely match the curve of that outer section where the reverse thrusters are, so that it's basically block for block the exact same curve, just flipped upside down and reversed. And that, I'm hoping, will lend to a more unified sort of theme. That being in place, now it's time to start looking at these profiles and not just individual, like one or two or three shapes intersecting the three different planes profiles. I mean layer by layer, kind of setting up the way I want things to look. You can see we've just sort of defined the upper section of the ship's hull, the roof. We could call it the roof if spaceships had roofs. I don't think they do, but you know, it's a descriptive word that makes sense in this context. And then I realized before I could go any further that I had to fill in this area where the main propulsion thrusters are. I don't like leaving those kinds of areas hollow, because it just seems like it's an opportunity to kind of beef things up a little bit and help protect. If, for example, you get one of these gigantic thrusters destroyed and it explodes and there's some AoE damage that's wanting to traverse through something, there's going to be a little bit of extra armor there between the explosion and the thrusters above it, hopefully, that may prevent catastrophic cascading of damage to more areas of the ship that was necessary if we had just designed it a little bit better. So we fill it in, we spend a little time on that, and then comes the question of how we're going to make this area here behind the thrusters come together on the back of the ship, because one, it's part of the ship that you're going to be seeing an awful lot if, like me, you pilot your ships in mostly the sort of chase camera view. So it was important that way. But also the way it's going to intersect with the rest of the back end of the ship. I want to avoid, whenever possible, too many 90-degree angles in my hull designs, and too many 45-degree angles. I don't necessarily think 45-degree angles look bad, but whenever I see one, I'm always curious as to what I could do a little bit different or a little bit better. This part here is when we're starting to see really the essence of this whole idea of doing multiple layers of profiling. Is we've got that profile that we're basically using to define the shape, the curve on the back end of the ship, and now we're literally just placing cubes right on the very edge of that curve and then pulling them out and creating lines And as we create multiple lines, the shape of the back end of the ship starts to become very, very evident. If I really wanted to go the simple route, once this is done, I set it up on obviously the left side of that profile, and now we're doing the right side of the profile going towards the right propulsion thrusters. I could just connect all of these with the different slope blocks that are necessary to make nice, refined curves and angles and things where it's not seamless, but it's not really blocky and jagged the way it is now with the cubes. I could do that. I'm not going to do that, particularly and especially on the back end, the way it's coming together now. It's good for a start, but we need a little more detail, and I think we need a little more effort in order to turn it into something that we're really happy with. It's sometimes very, very easy to, I don't want to say give up on a portion of the ship once you've gotten to a certain point, because for me anyways, I look at what I would like to do and then I evaluate it based on how I feel I could pull it off. Do I have the blocks that I need? Do I have the understanding of how to use those blocks in order to make it happen? Most of the time the answer for me is no. I don't know exactly how to make it happen, but I have an idea. And if I give up on a section of the ship because I know I don't have a specific solution in mind, I lose the opportunity to get experience from the process and learn and kind of round out my skills a little bit. So right now, as far as the way everything is being placed and how everything is coming together, it's very, very simple, very straightforward. But we're going to be doing more to it than what you can see just based on the way those profiles indicate we would have the shape come together. If we wanted just a flat, dull back to the ship, I guess it wouldn't be specifically flat, but you know what I mean, like uninteresting section, we could just leave it as is, but we can do better. And the easiest way I'm thinking right now for us to do that is not to try and change this primary curve, like this wave almost like shape that it's got going to it so far, but to go with that, fill it out, get it all done, smooth it off with the appropriate blocks, and then make some changes to it. Push sections of it in, pull sections of it out, whatever it takes, just to break it up a little bit so that it's more interesting than this big wide section that's just doing the exact same thing from one side to the other. So that's one option that we have for the rear. But this is primarily, I think, a fit introduction to what I was talking about when it comes to making these different profiles and using them to delineate more complicated shapes than what we've done in the past. So here is another example, starting at the top and creating this sort of elliptical profile, and then from here we can kind of decide what parts of that profile are going to be directly connected in some way. Like, is there going to be a transition to the next layer and on down, or is that the end of this logical layer and then we're going to transition to something else directly beneath it? And what you'll see in the ship is a more obvious transition. So there's times to make a transition where it's supposed to be a smooth, unified element that's part of the ship, and other times when we want things to be obviously different from one another so that they stand out and we get that visual interest that comes from having different heights, different widths in various different places. So a lot of this right now is just, again, looking at what we had in place from the early profiling that we did very, very early in the build and deciding how we want that whole thing to work. And with regards to the front of the ship, which is basically where we're working now, one thing that I did is I changed the way the cylindrical section in the middle of the ship, the elliptical cylindrical section in the middle of the ship, transitions to the front section because it looks a little bit less like a penis now. And I'm actually, regardless of whether or not it looks like genitalia, I'm much happier with this, the way it's coming together. It's a much more refined, I think, sort of transition, and no complaints having made that change. But we've got that original shape, that front curve on the horizontal plane, and then we've got that curve coming down the, I guess not really the vertical plane. It's that curve that I told you I wasn't happy about because it's just basically two lines coming down from the top of the ship to the front. And I really wanted to make sure that before I committed to any shapes involving that I reworked it until I got something that I was happy with. And this is, again, the broken record thing whenever it comes to doing profiles. It's so much easier to make changes and evaluate different shapes and things that you've spent time on if you just have to change one block at a time, like one plane, basically one row or one layer, as opposed to having this whole 3D structure that you realize you're not happy with, and then you've got to kind of work with things on all 3 different planes and make sure they come together. This is really, really simple. You can see, again, that's comes down a little bit harshly. It's not a very balanced curve. It's like you kind of get the impression that it would be pretty close to flat across the top, and then it just drops off towards the nose, and that's not really what I'm looking for. And it's just a matter of using the right blocks to create the right shapes at the very beginning of the process, and then you can see now we've got a much more organic curve. It looks a lot better than it did a previous iteration ago, and it's hasn't taken us very long to get there, despite the fact that there's a number of different changes in the angle and the kinds of blocks that we're using. This section up here, I'm really only paying much attention to it because it's going to be an integral part of the transition down to the very front of the ship. And once we get that taken care of, I don't really want to have to come back up top and make a bunch of radical changes because I hadn't really thought about that final transition. Now here, I'm using the elliptical profile that we did for that central tube section. And just like I did on the back section of the ship when I was using the profile and then pulling things out to either side, I'm using that elliptical section and pulling it out towards the front of the ship, and then where necessary, having it change direction so that it follows the contours that I have in mind for all the different layers, starting from the top, and in this case working down, but all the way up to that sort of a horseshoe shape that we did that delineates between the cylindrical tube and the very front of the ship. It's kind of difficult to explain, but you get the idea now. We had that cylindrical part that we finished, and it just flares a little bit when it gets to the front of the ship, and now the profiles for the front of the ship are going in place. This is where I think it will become evident the benefit of doing this, because we've got curves and angles and all kinds of crazy stuff coming together in this one particular area. And by the time we've got all of these stacked layered profiles in place, you can look at it and you can see what it can look like if we get the sculpting right after the fact. You can see right now, it's basically, it's so easy to see what it could look like. And we've given ourselves all the tools that we need in order to make it look that way. It's just a matter now of sitting down and going through the process, working through it, joining the different layers so that they come together in a way that looks appealing. Organic is a good word that I seem to be using a little bit today. When you look at it, it doesn't look contrived. It doesn't look like it should be going one way when it actually goes another. I've been seeing that a lot lately, things where they just kind of, they zig when you would rather they zag, sort of thing. We've got a couple more layers that we can finish off up top here. Again, just refining that top sort of roof profile so that we get something that's a little bit more interesting than a flat surface. Looking at the back, we've got a pretty good handle on what's going on back there. It's still, like I say, not done, but we're making good progress there. And then we end up with a little bit of time at the very end here to close a couple of things off where I know they're going to be closed off and stay closed off, barring any kind of cosmetic additions later on. So this is as close as you can get to seeing the completed ship without it actually being completed. The next episodes, and I don't know how many there will be in this particular build, will just feature refining these different sections of the ship now that we've got everything laid out. So if you want to be notified about the next and future episodes, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.